Thank you very much for your time. This COVID period has been incredibly difficult for nonprofits, especially around finances. Just your experience on the ground, Soraya, what have you seen over the last 5 to 6 months?
Nonprofits have made such a contribution in the pandemic. Um, we know that out of 230,000, or maybe even over that figure now, of nonprofits in the country, most of them are what we term as micro, which means their annual income is less than 50,000. And a lot of these organizations don't have operating reserves. So, they might have had funds that would last them for 3 months maybe. But we're seeing, and it's not the rule, but we are seeing some organizations having to close or extremely cut back quite a bit at the moment because they relied mainly on a couple of donors. So, there was an interesting study that's just come out, and it's on corporate social investment. It's a study by Chickalulu Investments. So it's taking out a little section of nonprofits in the country, but I think it still gives a good temperature check. And of the respondents that they interviewed, about 2/3 have lost income. And, they've had to do things like corporates have done. They've had to take steps. So over a third of them have had to temporarily lay off staff or reduce working hours. They've had to reduce monthly salaries. But one thing that was very interesting I found, and I'm just speculating, but about 10% of profits reported not retrenching staff. And I think that might partly be because, in this sector, a lot of us are driven by obviously financial means like anyone else, but very inherently is the desire in the heart of what our passion is. So I presume a lot of people in the sector are still trying to do what they can with very little means. And it's a bit of a dichotomy because we're now needed more than ever, yet we're facing these financial struggles. And one other interesting thing that came out of that study is over a third of them talked about resilience. So they're quite optimistic. They think in the next 3 years they'll be able to return to levels of 2019. I think that's quite optimistic. But they're resilient, and I think it's part of what the nonprofit sector has been about, is to be able to provide these services that are so needed under very constrained conditions. So our nonprofits are suffering, a lot of them.
Soraya, as somebody who's a finance director of an organization that plays in this space, optimism is one thing. But if you don't have a clear path to how you're bringing in those rands and cents, how you are managing your operational costs on a daily and a monthly basis, the next 3 years as they're on this road to recovery could be made worse if the conditions within the country worsen.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And, this is why we also advocate trying to diversify your income. So, it's not only about looking at, it's having donor income and fair element of cost recovery and other income generation activities, but even within that donor window, to make sure that you are diversifying not only the location of your donors, but the type of donors that you are getting income from is very critical. And like you say, you need a plan for financial sustainability. So it's important to sit down with your board and to, we can talk about it and say, okay, we're going to focus on making sure we cover our costs. But unless you write it down, does it really become cemented in your philosophy? And I think over the next 3 years, that's something that nonprofits have to almost live and breathe. And it isn't something that sits in my office as a finance person. It's something that has to be inculcated as almost, a culture that infiltrates your organization about being financially sustainable. And every employee has to buy into that. And, before it almost felt like, you had to convince people that we're going to save up for a rainy day, or we're going to diversify and do everything we can for a rainy day. But, obviously COVID has been such a stark reality that I don't think we need any convincing anymore.
You guys put together a pocket guide to understanding the donor world. Now, what we know is that COVID has disrupted how people fundraise. majority of it went online. And when you speak to the online guys like Give and Gain and Back a Buddy and a list of others, they'll tell you their research tells you that the online donation model is set to increase. So, Soraya, what do you think the landscape is going to look like?
Obviously, online fundraising has been a fabulous tool. It depends on your cause. It's never going to be your fundraising plan. It's never going to be a standalone plan. It's just one element of your bigger fundraising scheme. And I think it needs to be reviewed that way. I mean, having a little donate button on your website is not going to be your fundraising plan. We did a little experiment ourselves with digital fundraising, and we held a course on it just in this COVID period to see what it was like to be on those platforms and what kind of response you're getting. It's a very competitive and a very loud platform. So obviously you have to make yourself stand out. But at the same time, it's so important to respect, what we call this fundraising cycle. So, you're going to have your case for support. You're going to have a compelling story. You're going to do your prospect research. Some of it might be through online digital fundraising. Others might be through, corporate donors or foundations or international agencies, and then to cultivate that. So the cultivation is so crucial. The thing about the online fundraising is it's somebody who gives because they've read a story and it just pulls their heart in the moment. And so it's very difficult to cultivate a relationship and keep that relationship going when it's through this sort of mechanism. So it's important to recognize that cultivation aspect. When we have individual donors, there's things you do, such as inviting them to your events, annual campaigns that you do, giving them access to newsletters and so on. So it's applying those kind of concepts to that. The other thing we found as well with digital fundraising is the last step, or it's not a last, it's a continual, but on the fundraising cycle is stewardship. And of course, maintaining that relationship and just being able to say thank you. And so it's very hard to connect and say thank you to your donors without doing a blanket thank you. And it is important to thank your donors. So it's just, like I said, just realizing that that is just one little avenue towards a bigger fundraising scheme and plan and resource mobilization plan that your organization needs to implement as well. Yeah.
You talked about platforms being incredibly loud, especially online platforms. But we've seen a lot of celebrities rise to the occasion and use their fame and their position to drive campaigns. Has the donor world not changed? I mean, COVID has disrupted all the industries. It's innovated, it's destroyed, it's killed. But has the donor world not changed itself?
I believe it has, and it is changing. It's like, they say the stock market has no memory. In a crisis, we are building the stories of our history, and things are changing. From the perspective of, not so much on the celebrity side, we sort of distinguish in our sector and about the difference between charity and philanthropy. So, charity are these fundraising drives, and they're in the moment, they're in the crisis, but the philanthropy and the longer term systemic changes are what's going to actually make the changes to society in the long run. You need both. But we've seen changes in the donor world ourselves. For instance, when the pandemic hit, donors immediately said, whatever funding you have in a grant, some of them said, we'll make it flexible, use it to cover your operations if you need to. And that's sort of one cause we've been advocating for years. There's always this tension between, what does it cost a nonprofit to operate? And we always say it's like going to a restaurant. You're not going to just pay for, the ingredients of the chicken dish you're eating. Somebody has to pay for the electricity, the waiter, the cooks, all of those overhead costs. So we've already seen that change a little bit in the mindset of donors who are recognizing even further and making those offerings to make their donations a little bit more flexible so that nonprofits can do their work. And we also talk about funding the core. So, as programs in an organization come and go, the core of that organization will always be there. They will always be advocating for the causes that they believe in. And that core organization needs to be sustained and funded. So, hopefully those kind of changes will last in the long run. But that's just a little bit about the donor world changes that we've seen.
Final question from me. You put together a pocket size guide. How important is it now to understand the donor world?
It's critical. This pocket guide was put together by our founder, Sheila Gastro, and it's available as an ebook for free. But she categorizes the donor world into 6 different categories. So it's important to assess those categories and see where you fit with them. The first one is individual giving. Then we have private and corporate foundations. We also have international aid agencies and foundations, religious organizations, and official international development agencies and governments. So there's different approaches and different prospecting that you would do with these various different types of donors. There's websites you could visit. We have a funding finder database that we offer clients as well. So it's, you need to search according to what your causes are and matching up with what their interests are. So, we talk about getting away from this charitable paradigm, and really what donors are looking for is somebody who they want to invest with, someone who has a common mission, who has common values, who can help to deliver their mandate alongside them, and at the same time is going to be around tomorrow. So that financial sustainability element is very important. So this pocket guide just describes the different types of donors and the way to approach them. But it's also very important to just keep in mind a few things when you are looking for this funding. And probably the first thing is that, donors are people like you and I. They have families, they've got children, they've got passions and causes. So it's just cultivating that relationship and finding out what it is that they are wanting to invest in. And of course, not selling. My colleague always says, don't sell ice to the snowman. So it's making sure that your mandate aligns with their mandate. And then, we also advocate a model called advancement. And so we talk about fundraising, but that's just one of the elements, and the pocket guide also touches on this. But, there's other elements in your organization, and taking a proactive approach rather than reactive at this time, and building those elements so that they're strong positions you to attract support. So very often we find organizations that, have focused on elements like their leadership and governance, making sure they have a well-functioning board, making sure they have a clear strategic plan, also making sure their financial management systems are robust and that they can be trustworthy and account for the investment that has been shared with them, and making sure also that they build their voice and visibility. So, if you're an organization who is helping vulnerable women and children, it's important to build that advocacy voice and also to make yourself visible on platforms, whether it's, radio stations, magazines, online, etc. So, if you look at these various elements and really try and build them, you may find that you are actually going to be attracting support, and people will notice you and want to team up with you and partner with you to help you